India. Okay, this is fantastic. We're going to get going. We have 75 people online, including people from India, Italy, New Zealand, the States, all across Canada. So a lot of us are wrestling with the issue of changing our own and changing the behavior of other people. So I should kick off quickly by introducing myself. I'm Georgia Mason. I'm director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. And this important seminar represents the first of a series we're going to have on understanding human behaviour to help animals. As this in Canada, this unnervingly warm autumn continues, and some of you in the UK are having incredible storms. And as the United Nations begs for humans to change their behaviour at the COP summit, I should just remind everyone to be grateful for the land that we're on. And if you're in Canada, to remember that the land is not settlers, but really the traditional and unceded and treaty lands of First Nations, Inuits and Métis peoples. And of course, I'm so sorry, go away. And of course, for those of us in Guelph, we're on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, one of the Anishinaabex peoples. Now, today we have Suzanne Rogers and Joe White, two self-professed behaviour change nerds who in 2016 set up the organisation Human Behaviour Change for Animals, now Human Behaviour Change for Life. And they both have incredibly diverse and interesting experience working with humans on animal-related topics in a whole diverse array of sectors. They're going to tell you more about that now. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them. But Suzanne and Joe, welcome. So excited to hear you talk today.
Hello, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Animal Welfare Foundation of Canada and Guelph University. We're really pleased to be with you this afternoon for many of you, this evening for us, and whatever time it is for wherever you are around the world. So welcome to this session, Applying the Science of Behaviour Change to Help Animals. We're just going to start with a bit of an introduction to who we are, and really sort of kind of setting the scene for tonight's talk. So first of all, we'd just like to pose that question of why human behaviour change? So because if we understand why humans do the things they do and what drives them to change, we'll be more effective at making the world a better place for people, animals and the planet. And this is very much something that has driven us in everything that we've done in our career, but also in the lead up to first founding Human Behaviour Change for Animals and now Human Behaviour Change for Life as we've broadened our work out. So my name is Joe White, and my co-founder and co-presenter, co-director is Suzanne Rogers. And we are delighted to join you tonight to talk about this area. And how we work is we apply the science of human behaviour change, looking at understanding what's happening, why people do what they do or don't do what we might want them to do, in the focus to improve animal welfare. But we now broadened out our work, recognising the interconnected nature of everything in the world. So we've broadened out our work to also encompass human well-being, environmental issues and conservation. So we're starting to work with other organisations as well, which has been really helpful with our work in animal welfare as well. We have a growing team of specialists and experts from a whole host of different backgrounds, including social science, a word I can never say, econometrics, which is a kind of really useful area from the sort of behavioural economic side of things, but also animal welfare, human well-being and environment conservation. So tonight's session, we're going to cover a number of different areas. Going to give you an introduction to human behaviour change. And we gather from those who've already completed the survey that we did a little kind of survey with you, with some of you, and thank you very much for completing those who did, because it gave us some insights in terms of some of your background, the sort of challenges that you're dealing with, but also the things that you might like to get out of this. And we know that there's some social scientists amongst you, so this might be a kind of a bit of a revision for some of you, but also introducing new concepts for others. And we're going to talk about areas such as understanding change and impact. And this is a framework that we use at Human Behaviour Change for Life. And throughout the session, we'll provide some top tips, tools, and we're going to have a bit of interaction with you. So get ready to join in on the chat, because we'll have a few sessions. So I'm now going to hand over to Suze, who's going to talk you through the next part.
You can move on the slide. There we go. So we'd like you to think about these questions, because whenever we're looking at changing other people's behaviour, it's really helpful to look at ourselves first. So in the chat, if you could pop, dogs barking, if you could pop some of the answers to these questions. So first of all, what behaviour have you tried to change? Have you tried to eat more, exercise? No, eat less, exercise more? And yeah, brilliant, some examples coming in. To become a morning person, oh, that's a really tricky one. And then next, so once you've got your example in your head, and feel free to share them, it's really fun reading those. Did you have the knowledge, or do you have the knowledge for how to make that change? Do you understand what a healthy diet looks like? Being on time, oh, some tricky ones coming in. And once you've thought about if you have the knowledge, do you have a really good reason for why you want to make the change? Do you know the benefits for if you make that change? Still someone having some great examples here. I love plastic consumption, being more present, all really good. So next, was it easy? Have you made the change and you're new people, or are you still struggling? If it was easy, why do you just take a second to think about why you think it was so easy to do? And if not, what do you think the challenges were? And again, I love the examples. Drink more water, I share that one. Knew what to do, had a reason. It's still tricky. So the reason why we wanted to explore this is because so often it's really common for us to know what we want to change, for us to really understand it, have the knowledge about the change we're trying to make, have a really good reason and know the benefits. And yet we still struggle. So even though we know the benefits, we still struggle to change our own behaviour. And yet, as people trying to advocate for animals, it's often so easy to fall back onto the kind of idea that if we just tell people, if we just give them knowledge, if we just explain and explain and explain so that they know the benefits, and then they'll change. And we kind of labour this point, but it's so important because it's so easy to fall back on that. We know from ourselves that it's not enough. Knowledge is not enough. There's other factors at work, and we need to understand them before we can address the behaviour change. And the next slide is just another element to consider. So things have been a bit slow tonight, but when it comes, oh no. So the next question is, about thinking of something you've tried to change, have other people tried to make you change anything? So if other people try to make you change something about your behaviour. So for me, people always see the fact that I write emails at crazy times of night. I'm online at crazy times of night because I'm a night owl. I've got no intention, unlike some of you, of becoming an early bird. And they're always saying, you should go to bed earlier. And it really annoys me because they don't know what my life is like. They don't know that I'm very much cleverer at night and things like that. So it puts my back up. It annoys me. It makes me feel they don't understand me. And so it's really worth reflecting on this, because if we're going to be trying to change other people's behaviour, we need to remember what it feels like when that's done to us. So those are just a couple of things to think about. I think we're back to Joe now. Joe, you're on mute. There we go. I think Joe's
the controls are being slightly delayed for some reason. I think it's my computer's struggling tonight, so things are slightly delayed, so I have to apologise for that. So in terms of human behaviour change, it encompasses so many different disciplines and areas, and this is one of the things that we feel sort of very passionate about, but also think it's such an amazing opportunity. So we've just outlined here sort of some of the areas that we pull upon when we're looking at human behavior change. So everything from the social sciences, such as psychology, sociology, anthropology, etc., lots of ologies, things like behavioral economics, but also looking at things like communications, social marketing, the areas around innovation, design, and we can utilize these in varying different ways. So we can look at this through the lens of campaigning, through what we might be doing from an educational point of view, so many different areas in terms of its application. And it's something that we've looked at in terms of kind of how we can develop this in a framework that helps support people to go through the process. So we've developed this framework of understand, change, and impact. And we're going to talk you through this, highlighting a few sort of useful tools and tips and things that you could look at from a point of view of leveraging the power of human behavior change. So we use this for projects, campaigns, programs, conversations, lots of different areas that we work upon. And in essence, what it's made up of is the need to first understand what's happening, why people are behaving the way they are or not behaving in certain ways, but also to unpack some of the real challenges, the messy situations that we might be dealing with. And there's so many messy situations that we're dealing with in the world at the moment that having some sort of framework with which to go through that can really be helpful in starting to map out the kind of messy systems. So we use a lot of the systems thinking when we're starting to do that understanding. This feeds through into the next phase, which is change. So we use the evidence-based models to understand, and then we build upon that and use evidence-based interventions to test and deliver change. So it's about actually testing out what works, learning from that process and developing it. Important throughout this is we all have our objectives for delivering impact. So we might be working in different areas of animal welfare, whether that be looking at farm animal welfare, companion animals, research, for example, research animal welfare. But we want to make sure that we deliver an impact. So throughout this, right from the beginning of that phase of understanding, we start to put in place baseline measures for monitoring and evaluating whether we're delivering that impact, but also weaving that throughout the process so we can keep checking in to make sure that we've delivered what we're looking to and ultimately improving animal welfare. We take a research and design approach, so we develop what we're doing, we look to innovate, and really important to us in the approach that we take is very much a co-creation approach. So we work directly with those that are involved, those who are either seeking the change or those who are involved in the change. So this is kind of a really important element to our work. And it made me smile when I looked at some of the things that are coming about people wanting to change. And someone said about stretching and how they wanted to start stretching. And what we were going to say is we like to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. And there's so much evidence that talks about the kind of need to help the brain, help the body, that actually it's really important to when you're listening to talks and you're listening to presentations, to have that moment where you kind of just have a little stretch, a little move around. So please feel free, like the Pussycat, just to have a little move and not get sort of stuck in a rigid position, because I creak a lot when I kind of do these things. So it's taking human behavior change from so many different elements, including what we're doing when we're listening to talks like this. So I'm going to hand back over to Suze for the next bit.
The cat wants to stay. I hope you're all still moving.
Cat has moved on my screen.
So I'm going to have to wait. There we go.
Unfortunately, the cat was moved on mine.
Starting with the first one, understand. So as Joe said, we need to understand behaviour before we can try to change it. There we go. So the first one, there's the parable of the elephant. And so there's a parable of 5 men standing around an elephant, and each one of them has got a different part of the elephant in front of them. And so imagine they're the first, or they're blind. Did I mention that? That's a really crucial point. So there's 5 blind men around an elephant. So the first one is describing the animal in front of him, and they're standing by the leg, and he's saying the elephant is like a trunk or a tree trunk. The one standing by the trunk is saying this animal's like a snake. The one standing by the tail said this animal's like a flappy thing, and so on. You get the idea. Now, the thing that's important in this is that they're all using the information in front of them to form an opinion about what animal's in front of them. But of course, they're only seeing part of the picture. And we want you to have this in mind whenever you're looking at anything to do with behaviour, because it's so important that we know that we're looking at the full picture and not just at one part of it. Otherwise, we're going to get a really skewed and biased idea about what's going on. So it's really, really important that we test assumptions. Now, Joe and I have both worked in animal welfare for many years, and it's so common to say things like, we've got a project about cats. We'll have a meeting about it. Let's imagine that we're all cat owners, and what are they thinking, and what do they want to do, and why are they doing something? And we all just put ourselves into the mind of cat owners, but that's all assumptions. And it's so common for this to happen, and for some quite detailed interventions to be based on what we think are the reasons that other people are doing things. So this slide is a really impassioned call for you to always test your assumptions, always try to spot them, and always step back and think, am I looking at the whole of the elephant? So having a curious mind is also a recognised anthropological approach. So we want you to think of elephants, always.
And another approach that we've utilised is the ecological model and framework. And this has been really useful from a point of view of starting to kind of map out the systems that people and the challenges that they might be facing. And there's things that might be influencing this. And this example is actually taken from a recent piece of work that we undertook, looking at engaging farmers and looking at messaging to farmers. It was particularly looking at grazing management, so through sort of the lens of regenerative agriculture. But equally, this could be undertaken from a point of view of grassland management, say, for example, to improve the health of sheep, for sheep farmers, for example. So what it does is it looks at different elements of that system. So first of all, we look at it from the individual perspective. So we have the farmer and potentially their immediate family. So what's their story? What's their background? What's the kind of information and the journey that they've been on and the influences that they have? With this particular example, we were looking at kind of some of the direct influences in the environment. So we had things like the livestock that they were responsible for, the direct environment, and the differences in the geography where they might be their farm might be, the staff on the farm themselves, but also the kind of aspects they needed to take into account in terms of the land. But likewise, when you're looking at this, say, for example, with the context of the sheep farmer, for example, it might be thinking about the environment those sheep are being kept on and how you maintain their health and well-being. One of the challenges we have in the UK, for example, is issues around lameness in sheep due to some of the places that they're being kept. So it's another kind of aspect within their environment that we need to take into account. We then move out another layer where we're starting to look at peers, friends, those kind of areas that are the social network, the influences. So this might also include people like experts, advisors, people who come onto farm. It might be the vets, for example, and how they're influencing within that framework and that system. Moving out to the next layer of the system, we're looking at those areas that can be influencing around sort of cultures, the cultural influences, values. So along in this particular example, we were considering things like farm organisations, the farming press and media, environmental organisations, but also academia, who's selling the products. So again, sort of thinking about this from an animal welfare point of view, who are those kind of drivers? Who's setting the culture? And then as we move into that final layer, we've got the kind of areas to do with policy. So things like looking at government policy. So in the context of animal welfare, who is it that's looking to develop policy? Policymakers themselves, what is happening and what discussions are going on there. But we've also got things like pressure groups. So from a point of view, whether it be public or consumer pressure, media and influencers. So there's lots of different elements to this in terms of mapping the system. So it's kind of, it can be a really useful tool, both from a point of view of making us go through and think about who's involved, but also to start visualizing that system. And then moving on to the next one, I'll hand back to Suze.
I think the screen's not happy tonight.
No, it's changing on my screen, but
It's
not.
coming. There we go. So another really useful model to have in your head when you're looking at understanding the situation is this idea of the stages of change model. And so first of all, we're looking at pre-contemplation. This is where, for example, as a consumer, you're not even thinking about your buying practices. It's not occurring to you that about welfare or about where you buy diamonds or clothes or anything like that. The next one is contemplation. So this is where you're just starting to think about your purchases. Maybe you've seen something that's made you think about it. You're starting to think about it. It's come onto your radar. The next one's preparation. So this is where people, for example, use Google or start to think a bit more actively about what they might buy, what they might do, and so on. Then we have action. They're actually doing the new behavior. So in terms of consumers, they're buying the more ethical product. And then maintenance. And as we can all appreciate, this is the really tricky one. Keeping those habits going, making them become habits, keeping the behaviors going and not slipping back. The bit in the middle shows that every time we can, at any stage, we can relapse, we can go back down a stage, and that also we can learn from this. And this is a really useful model to have either when you're doing a campaign, because the thing we really need to bear in mind is that if we try to address people at the wrong place, they're going to get a little bit annoyed or disenfranchised. So if someone's at contemplation and we're telling them all the actions to do, that might be a bit too much. We might need to help them prepare first. But at the same time, if they're at action stage and we're giving them lots of reasons still, thinking they're at contemplation or treating them as if they're at contemplation, there's going to be a disjointedness there as well. So this model can be really useful when you're planning campaigns or how to change behavior, but also just in a consultation. And we do a lot of work with animal behaviorists and animal vets, and this is really important for them. So if they can ask a few questions to understand the situation and work out where someone is in the stages of change, and then they can use their communication skills appropriately and match what they're saying to where the person is. And this is also relevant in things like introducing legislation to a country. If they introduce legislation too early, when no one's really thought about it as a problem, you're likely to get low compliance. And so this is just a small taster to a model that we find really useful and very applicable to different situations, whether you're changing the behavior of an individual or community or the whole world.
And another model we wanted to share with you was this one in terms of John Fisher's process of transition curve. The reason we like this is it kind of highlights sort of some of the emotional experiences people can go through as they're experiencing change. And it's not necessarily something that is kind of guaranteed that people will go through every stage of this, but it's something I think is really useful, both from considering how we feel ourselves and the sort of kind of emotions it might generate when we're going through the process of change, but also when we're working with others who are also going through that process of change, and the sorts of things that it might kind of evoke in them. So you think about kind of the initial stages of someone being approached to deliver a change. So it might be someone's thinking or concerned about their animals' health and well-being. So they're feeling a bit anxious about it. They take them to the vets. They feel maybe they get some news. They feel like they're doing something, so it feels positive. So they get a kind of positive emotional response back. But then there's also the kind of fear from a point of view, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for me in terms of what impact is it going to have on me? It may be that they feel threatened. It might feel that threatening, the sort of a challenge to their own identity about kind of them as a caring pet owner, for example. They might also feel elements of guilt. Why didn't I act on this earlier? You know, did I do this? Did I do this to my own animal? Which again might sort of lead to sort of concerns around sort of areas to do with depression, despair. They feel like they've really let their animal down. But we might then move towards gradual acceptance. There are obviously other areas along here. So people can feel quite angry about change. Change can be really challenging, as we've already highlighted. That people may go through a process where people actually deny it. You think about what, we've got COP on at the moment, and you think about issues around climate denial. We also may see people who are in disillusionment. They feel very sort of let down. It doesn't feel like it relates to them. They sort of feel disillusioned. They don't want to engage with the process, so they opt out. But what we want to do is we want to support people through that process, but also support ourselves if we're going through change, and kind of recognize those emotions. And while we're sort of moving through the slides, maybe if there's anything that kind of resonates with the slides that we have, please do feel free to pop things in chat, and we'll pause and just check from time to time if anyone wants to share anything. So I'm going to move on to another model, which we utilize quite a lot, which is the behaviour change wheel and COM-B model. For those who are sort of like us in terms of behaviour change geeks, we do love this model, because what's so useful about it is it takes you right through the process. So you can go through from having that kind of messy problem, trying to identify kind of the behaviours that you want to focus on, right through to delivery of interventions, looking at the behaviour change techniques that are most applicable and how it might sit in the wider policy landscape. So it's really, really helpful, whether you're talking about a sort of operational project or you're talking about changes to legislation, for example. In the centre is what's called the COM-B element. So that's capability, opportunity, and motivation. And capability is made up of two elements, that's psychological and physical. We find that quite often people get hold of the psychological and sort of focus on that. So they talk a lot about raising awareness, increasing knowledge, educating people, which may well be important from the perspective of what's needed in the particular animal welfare issue. But quite often the physical is left underutilized in the sense that with behaviours, we obviously need to develop the skill around the behaviour. So, for example, if you're thinking about worming a cat, for example, someone might understand that they need to worm their cat, but do they actually have the skill to give the animal the pill, for example, undertake that kind of worming process? So it's thinking about the kind of whole package with capability. With opportunity, we have social and physical. So social is the kind of, that relates to the person's social network, the influences, and this can be both positive and negative. So we're thinking about the behaviours that they might be doing that we might not want them to do. So, for example, you think around pet obesity, it might be that they're doing a lot of tit-bicking. So that's a social norm within their family. Everyone gives the dog a treat, and it's just something that gets carried along. So there isn't the kind of structure there or the social support to make that change. But likewise, there are a lot of kind of initiatives that are starting to pull upon social support. So actually giving people the environment where they can support them to change. So things like in human health, where there's been things like Weight Watchers, that's pulled a lot on that kind of social support. And there's a great opportunity to look at that from an animal welfare point of view, how you can sort of set up social support to help people. Another area of the other area of opportunity is physical opportunity, and thinking about things like the resources that the person has access to. So does someone have the financial resource, the time to actually undertake the behaviour that we're seeking? So, for example, it might be doing health checks for farm animals, for example. Is it that they are really time poor, or there are issues around enough staff to actually do those physical checks? So by sort of starting to build this picture up about what's there and what isn't there, you can start to really understand what's driving the antecedents of the behaviour. And finally, we have motivation. Not last or least, but motivation is a sort of critical element as well. So that's automatic and reflective. And anyone who's a fan of Daniel Kahneman may have read Thinking Fast and Slow. And this also sort of kind of pulls on this automatic habitual behaviour, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. So those things we do kind of really easily. Think about if you've been driving for years and driving to work, you think about lots of other things at the same time as driving. You might think about your shopping list at the same time, what else, other jobs you've got to do, as opposed to reflective. So thinking about if we're going to change a behaviour, someone's going to need sort of a certain amount of energy, physical and mental energy, to actually do that behaviour. So if we're thinking, for example, about handling techniques, where people may have very automatic habitual behaviours around how they handle animals, if we're seeking change, we're going to have to move them across to reflective and have to support them through that process. So it's taking these things into account to build up a picture. The red layer starts to talk about intervention functions that Susie's going to highlight a little bit more in detail in a moment. And then the grey element of the behaviour change wheel is that policy landscape. So the things we need to consider and the support that we might need to have in place to facilitate these changes. So I'm going to just remind you to keep moving and have a little stretch and a move around, because it's really important to feed that grey matter as we're going through and sort of throwing lots of different models and frameworks at you.
So back to me. So now we've understood the problem from lots of different angles. Now we're going to think about how we can change the situation, change behaviour. And as Jo pointed out, there's many different ways of change, many different routes to change, and many, many different possible interventions. We're not going to cover them all today. That would be far too many. But just to give you a kind of a snapshot view, hopefully they'll appear in a minute. There we go, they're coming on. So there's education, which is about knowledge and understanding. So although we started off by saying knowledge isn't going to lead to behaviour change on its own, it can be a really important part of the process. And of course, that's especially true when you're trying to move people from pre-contemplation to contemplation and so on. Training is more about skills, also reducing barriers and increasing people's capability. Persuasion, there's so much we could say there. Using communications to induce feelings and cue action is how they define it with the behaviour change wheel. Modelling, so kind of giving role models, examples that people can follow. There's a lot of that being used in the celebrity world. Sort of campaigns often enlist celebrities to show modelling of good behaviour, of the desired behaviour. Incentivization, of course, expecting reward, and that could come in form of chocolate or money or all sorts of other rewards as well, like Jo touched on, with different sorts of types of motivation, and that's linked very much as well. Then of course we can change behaviour using punishment and some negative elements as well. And although we don't focus on that at behaviour change for animals, there is a place, for example, a place for those kind of approaches. For example, where would we be without laws and legislation? And so the expectation of punishment or something negative happen can be an important behaviour change option. And that links with restrictions. Having rules and so on can reduce the chance of occurring. And there's also environmental restructuring. So as we all know, that the environment plays a huge role in influencing our behaviour. We only have to step outside and we might quickly put on a jumper or reach for a cup of tea if it's cold. So the environment affects our behaviour. And just by putting things in the environment, we can manipulate people's behaviour. So there's some great videos online of people, really exciting kind of bins that make noises and things that encourages people putting their rubbish in an appropriate place. So there's lots to explore there. We're not going to cover them in more detail today, because something that runs through all of this is the communication and what we call conversations for change. So how can we have really useful dialogue, whether that's with individuals, with organisations, or on a much wider level, whether that's through resources or one-to-one spoken conversations. And this is where we're passionate about everything, but we're really passionate about the communications angle. And so, for example, we have values-based communications, and this is a really good way of creating a bridge between yourself or your organization and your people or person or society you're trying to change. And the basics of this is that if we consider if we're A and they're B, then we're very different, coming from different places, there will always be some similar values in the middle. And so that can be difficult to find, but through careful questioning, through asking things, this can come out. So, for example, I've done some work in the dog meat industry, spending time in dog meat markets in Southeast Asia. And even there, where you think you're really unlikely to have things in common with people, they're still, you know, you can talk about children, you can talk about weather, you can start on those commonalities and start on those shared values before, to give you a really good starting point before you go to the places where you're different. And this leads to a few more communication tips. And so, as we touched on already, positive messages are generally better than negative messages, and they're more effective. Negative messages, if they're really, really negative and very hard-hitting, can be successful. But otherwise, positive messaging is much more successful. And there's quite a lot of evidence for that in the psychology literature. Also, community and peer support is so important and often underestimated. We all know, like, social norms we've talked about already, and we know ourselves that if we have support and our peers are doing something similar, it's easier to change our behaviours. And there's some campaigns who are really using this. For example, Veganuary have huge support systems in place, and there's many other examples. When we get to the end of the Q&As, we can ask you for some examples that have struck you as we've gone through. And another example is pledges and labelling. We can use these to change behaviour, because if we encourage people to say they'll do things and then they label themselves as the type of person who will do that thing, they're more likely to behave consistently with that pledge than they would otherwise. So an example is, if someone labels themselves as an animal lover, and then we explain or frame in our view what an animal lover looks like and how a responsible owner, you know, neuters their pet perhaps, or vaccinates them perhaps, or takes care about them in a certain way. If they've then taken that on, that they're a responsible owner, they've labelled themselves as a responsible owner, they've pledged to be a responsible owner, and then when a behaviour comes along that we want to introduce and we put it in that framework, it's more likely to be taken on than if we hadn't have come at it from that angle, as it were. There's so many more communication tips, but we're going to move on because tonight's a taster for some of these things.
And another area that we feel very strongly and passionately about is the opportunities that habit has. And obviously I touched on this a little bit in terms of motivation, but we feel that habit is something that's quite often underutilized, but it has the potential to deliver lasting, sustainable change. And it's got a few sort of kind of selling points. 40 to 50% of our daily behaviors are habitual. You actually start to think about things that you do without thinking about it, like cleaning your teeth, brushing your hair, putting the kettle on, those sorts of things that just happen because they're things that you do on a day-to-day basis, you do routinely. And once formed, habits are stronger than intention. So if we're thinking about doing another behavior, and this links back to all those lovely examples that you shared at the beginning, and when you was talking about kind of some of the challenges around it, it's much easier to do something that you just do already habitually and automatically than actually start to implement a new behavior, because a habit requires less cognitive energy and motivation than doing something new. So it can be really challenging, but it also presents us with a fantastic opportunity. And a study found that habits take root in children by the age of 9. So if you think about, again, looking at sustainability, looking at sort of opportunities around education, and actually delivering sort of lasting solutions for animal welfare, actually sort of thinking about these being embedded from an early age is really important. But you also think about kind of children who've grown up around animals in different contexts and how some of those behaviours have become quite habitual in the way that they approach animals and how they handle them. It has huge potential in animal welfare due to the routine nature of our management and care. So you only have to kind of think about the fact that many of the things that we do around animals, whether it be feeding, walking, exercising, looking into the environment, how they're housed, how they're cared for, healthcare, these are done on, lots of these are done on a routine basis. So it presents lots of fantastic opportunities for habit formation. So thinking about creating those sustained behaviours using habits, we just wanted to touch on a bit about habit formation, and then maybe ask you to kind of think about a habit that you might like to form. So Charles Duhigg wrote a really useful book about habit formation, and he referred to the habit loop. So we have habit loop here. So in terms of it's comprised of, it may seem very familiar to a lot of you in terms of that cue, what kind of triggers you to do the behavior, the routine response of doing the behavior, and the reward. So kind of what you get back, what's kind of going to help kind of motivate you to keep doing that behavior. And then an element of craving, so that kind of loop starts to come into place. And I was thinking about this this afternoon. I think it was yesterday or today, I sent the team at HBCL a picture of my dog staring at me while I was eating a banana, because I'm not quite sure if this is his habit or my habit, but it's definitely a sort of behavior that's become a bit of a loop. So the cue is I have a banana for my breakfast every day. So I'm in a bit of a banana habit. He hears the banana, so that's his cue to come running to me. He then stares at me intensely. So that's my cue to then give him a bit of banana. So this routine is being fed between the two of us. The reward for him is he gets his piece of banana and thinks that's very yummy. And the reward for me is I feel, oh, my lovely dog I've made him happy. He's had his banana. So it's kind of that kind of mutual habit formation between me and my dog Fred. So we have kind of another example up on the screen, which pulls on some of the work undertaken by B.J. Fogg. He looked at kind of how you can link habitual behaviours when you're starting to form them. So what you do is you sort of start to think about kind of what you're doing routinely already. So for example, you might enter the kitchen at a certain time every day. So for me, it would be enter the kitchen in the morning and I put the kettle on. But it's thinking about kind of that thing that you're doing at a certain point. So when I enter the kitchen, I will put the kettle on, or I want to increase my water intake. So I might take a mouthful of water so that then you're looking at kind of the reasoning behind doing it. So the kind of motivation, the kind of thing that's driving you to do it. So in this case, we're trying to be healthy. So it's the recommended healthy water intake. For me, it might be my caffeine levels go back up, so I'm kind of full of energy. But you get the gist. What we're trying to do is we're linking it to something that we're already doing. So with the tea, because that's such a strong habit for me, I put the kettle on and I make a cup of tea every day. I might want to link a new habit to that. So it might be, for example, playing with my dog. Rather than giving him bananas, I might play ball with him, for example. But you can start to layer these behaviours in. So if you think about kind of moments where you have a routine activity with animals. So for example, I've done a lot of work with horses. So it might be when you go down and you're feeding the horse, you do a routine health check. There's certain points in our kind of routines that we can do this. So we just want to take a moment. If you could share any habits that you might like to introduce and start to think about kind of how you might link that in. So is there a habit you could link it to? Is there something, a clear cue that you need to put in place to trigger you to do that behavior? So thinking about what might cue you to actually do the new habitual behavior. And what reward might you need to have in place to make you sort of encourage you to keep doing the behavior. And a reward could be, you give yourself a bit of chocolate, you celebrate, you kind of, B.J. Fogg's a great one for celebrating and telling yourself you're great because you've done the behavior. Just have take a moment and have a think what you could put in place to sort of get that habit forming. And please do feel to share your thoughts on chat. So just give people a moment to share any thoughts. So we've got one here in terms of brushing my dog's teeth could be paired with brushing your own teeth. Yes. So brushing the teeth is such a great example in terms of being ripe for habit formation, because it's something, you know, you do once, twice, 3 times a day. So you've got another one, stretching and rolling, need to tie it to listening to the Archers podcast. I love that. Tidying up and actually clearing the floor. So that's a really good one. So thinking about how you're doing those sorts of things. And then we've got another one here in terms of clients, kettle training. When I put this kettle on, I do 2 minutes training so that I fit into my schedule. Yeah, that's brilliant. So it's that kind of like thinking about how you can link those in. Please keep sharing, but we'll keep going with the presentation. I'll hand back to Suze.
So another kind of top tip is to think about or bear in mind cognitive biases. And we're going to cover one of confirmation bias because it's very relatable. So the picture in the cartoon shows that if you can see an N and the other person can see a U, you might give 1,000 reasons why it's an N, but the other person is still seeing a U. And this is because this links to the concept of confirmation bias. So when we have some more information that comes at us, we tend to take on what fits with what we already know. So if someone tells us something and it fits with what we understand, what we're passionate about, our worldview, and then we're going to take that information on. But if it doesn't, we'll kind of not even register that new information, or we'll discard it. And this is important because we need, if we're trying to change people's behaviour, to make sure that it's taken on. And how do we do that? Well, in a nutshell, and this is we do a whole lectures on this. In a nutshell, it's going back to finding that common ground, asking questions so that we can frame things that fit with what people already believe and what's already important to them. Then our new information is less likely to be put in the bin, as it were. And next, we have just a couple of quotes for you that really illustrate the point of involving people. And this links to that sort of communication and etc. So the first one says, tell me and I forget, show me and I remember, involve me and I truly understand. It's a saying that many of us are very aware of, but I think we need to make sure we live it as well. So every time you start to tell someone something, pause and just think, how could I show them and how could I go even further and involve them? And that's a really good thing to have in the back of your head when you find yourself going into that teacher mode and trying to sort of tell people things. And another phrase we love is from Barack Obama that says, I'm asking you to believe not in my ability to create change, but in yours. There's not enough for people to believe in you and that you can change things. We need them to believe in themselves. And there's so much behavior around that, but that's, again, one for another day. And the next one, I think we're having another quick move, so just a really quick wiggle before we go on to the final one, which is impact. So I'll pass back to Jo.
Yeah, so this sort of takes us back to that kind of journey that we've been going through in our framework of moving from understanding to delivering change to moving forwards into impact, and thinking about what we actually want to measure, what we want to kind of evaluate in that impact, and whether we really are delivering the impact we're seeking in animal welfare. So we've got a kind of number of different tools. Susie's going to talk to you about one which we particularly like.
So some of you in the chat have mentioned motivational interviewing, and this is one of our favourite of many motivational interviewing tools. So if you're having a conversation with someone, for example, you're a behaviourist or a vet, and you're giving someone information about their animal, or even if you're visiting a farm and suggesting some recommendations or something, you might say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to put into action everything we've discussed today? Now, if they say a 10, well, hey, great, job done. If they say, for example, a 3 or a 4, and then we might say, that's really interesting. So why is it a 3 and not a 1? And we try to frame in that way so that you're going, why is it more positive than it could have been? And the importance of using this tool, or the beauty of using this way of questioning, is that it's very gentle. It's not very confrontational, but at the same time, it's a very gentle way of working out how they've taken things on and if they're likely to do things, because that puts the responsibility back on them. Then they're less likely to be able to blame you that your recommendations are all rubbish and they don't like them. So we really love this tool as a gentle way of exploring differences and encouraging people to take responsibility for how they use what we might recommend them and the information we give them. And I'm going to move on there because there's so much more to discuss. And the final thing in our impact sort of section is that when we want to think about how it's going. So when we're trying to change people's behavior, or when we are changing people's behavior, we need to know how it's going. And just like when you're driving a car, thankfully, we don't need to understand every single element of what the engine's doing. We just need to know there's a big red light on the dashboard and something telling us to stop, or we're about to run out of fuel. So we need to think about what are those big things that we want to know about that we'll know if our work is successful. So we must think about what's on the client's or the person we're working with dashboard. What will make them feel that it's working and it's successful? And the best way of doing that is setting monitoring up with a client. We say client, that might be an individual you're working with, it might be a community, it might be something even wider. And this also helps us to celebrate small successes, because that's always good. But also we want to monitor and evaluate our own performance. And so if you're having conversations all the time and you're trying to teach or working in a one-to-one situation, keep records, think about which explanations worked better, what things resonated with people, how did you feel the rapport building was, and what can you learn from that? Be kind to yourself, always be kind to yourself. There's always many factors that influence why people do or don't do things, but measuring the impact in some way is really important.
And to wrap up, we had a few take-home messages that we just wanted to kind of just recap. So I think you'll sort of get the impression that we feel very strongly about that kind of importance of understanding, first of all. So really starting to unpack what's going on, whether it's in a kind of, you're working with an individual or you're dealing with a very messy sort of problem or situation. It's using these sort of evidence-based tools to really understand what's happening. And this kind of goes throughout in terms of utilizing human behavior change, the kind of science behind it. So that's through from the understand element, through delivering interventions that we need to test that they deliver change and the impact that we're seeking, but basing it on evidence-based models all the way through. And as Suze mentioned about the importance of not making assumptions, us humans, we're sort of wired to make assumptions because it's kind of quick and easy. It's those heuristics that kind of help us through the day, but it's checking in and thinking, am I just jumping to a conclusion here, or do I need to check in with this? Conversations for change. We could talk for so long on this, and we've been running a number of different training sessions with organisations in different countries around the world, supporting them to sort of utilise the science that can really be helpful on the coalface in having these conversations for change. And I think something that's come back through the chat, as well as the sort of points that we've been making, is about really truly involving people. And that's really sort of coming out with some of the comments that you've been making yourselves about the importance of involving people right from the beginning. My particular sort of love of the role of habit and how that has such opportunity for kind of delivering sustainable changes in the animal welfare world, with all those kind of routines and those contexts that we can utilize to develop sort of positive habits and look to sort of change some of the challenging habits that are in place. Important throughout this is to consider the impact. So thinking about how we're measuring that. Quite often we find when we're working with organisations, impact is something they want to deliver, but not necessarily the monitoring and evaluation that can really check in with that. Sometimes is a sort of second thought, and it's really important to sort of plan that in right from the word go. And I think an important point here is about embracing the complexities of behaviour change. We live in a kind of challenging and messy world, and with it brings lots of complexities, but the beauty of human behavioural science and practice is it can really help you sort of approach those complexities and start to unpack them and understand them and find solutions. So we just wanted to say thank you very much for listening. Please do get in touch, stay in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Just to let you know, we run regular in-person and online training courses. We have actually just launched a foundation course, which is for those who kind of are already familiar with human behaviour change, would be sort of a useful revision. For those who are new, it's that kind of introducing some of the concepts. We work with lots of different organisations around the world, offering consultancy, support, mentoring, whether that's with individuals or organisations. And we sort of support people in kind of unpacking those kind of messy situations through systems mapping, through kind of understanding what's going on and identifying solutions, so that we can ultimately share this geekery, because we love the geekery, but for our passion to help animals and improve animal welfare. So please do get in touch. If you're not familiar with us, we have a Facebook page, we're on LinkedIn. We also have a YouTube channel, which has lots of films from one of our first conferences back in 2016, which some fantastic speakers there. So some more up-to-date stuff as well, but there's a wealth of information on there. So please do visit that YouTube channel. So finally, we were going to just say, if you haven't seen us before, please sign up to our newsletter, which has lots of links on it. And we have kind of feedback from organisations that say that those links they found really useful. So we try to put things out that are going to help people in the work that they undertake. So get in touch. And are there any questions or any comments as we finish?